so that you could appreciate it on all sorts of different levels. And I think that's also part of the reason it sustains itself so well as all of us have grown up, because as children we were able to read it on one level, and then as adults we can reread it and go, oh my gosh, there's so much more here than we had originally thought. And my last point, is that Jack really revered, or revered may be the wrong word, Jack really was very, really good with kids. What happened was in the 60s and 70s, when he was doing, as you guys said, all of these pages, people would find their way to his house because he was Jack Kirby and people admired him. And instead of just cursory, like, hello, how are you? You know, him and Roz, his wife Roz, they'd invite these kids in, they'd feed them, they would, you know, and all of a sudden he'd have kids coming up, the kids who came from San Diego, that started, helped found the San Diego Convention. He put them in, which book do you guys know? Jimmy Olsen, in the Jimmy Olsen book. So he's got these kids coming up to his house who are in this club, who he's not only entertaining, he's taking time away from his work, etc. And then he puts them in the comic books. I mean, he really was very good with that kind of making everybody family. And that's just part and parcel of who he was. And I think a lot of that is represented, like in The New Gods and in Forever People, is just very well represented.
Sir, you want to build on it?
Yeah, I wanted to expand on that a little bit too. I used to work for Malibu Comics, which was in Thousand Oaks, and Jack Kirby actually made a trip to our office and had toured our office, and he invited the whole art department to his house, and every week, you know, up until like, you know, maybe about a week before he passed away, we would go to his house, and we would, you know, he would just tell us stories. And that was our thing on Wednesdays. We would go to the comic book store, and then we would go to his house for lunch, and Roz would make us lunch, and we would just kind of just hang out there, and he would just tell us stories, and just stories about everything. And he would even give us the artwork on a lot of his pages. But then you have Roz standing right at the front. Taking these, like, no, we can't be. So yeah, it was. That's what we used to do also, and he always welcomed us in until towards the end when Roz said he's not feeling good. You know, you guys have to come back next time. So, and that's how it was for us. But you know, maybe like the whole 6 months to a year that I was at Malibu from '93 to '95, you know, and we would all do that. So that was a really fun time in my life too. So I just, on what he just said about Jack welcoming everybody into his house, and he did that for everybody. And we would have, you know, at least a good 10 of us would be over the house, and we would sit there and he would just talk and we would just listen, you know. And then we went back to work and all hyped and stuff, and you know, so that was a good period.
Hey, Kevin?
Something that hasn't already been touched on is a little devil advocate thing here. Kirby's Fourth World was just amazing. It was just amazing. I loved it when I first read it. I got the honor to assistant edit on Mr. Miracle and write Mr. Miracle. But when it was first posited that we restart New Gods and Mr. Miracle, we were told by the powers that be, Kirby's DC work never sells. And indeed, if you look at New Gods and if you look at Forever People, they didn't even last a year. Some people have averred that he never really sold well on his own, by himself, that he always needed somebody else in order to sell well. And that just freaked me out. I'm sorry. I go, what do you mean? But this is the New Gods. This is Kirby. How can you say that? And unfortunately, it bears out that it didn't sell well. And I'd love the panel's.
Well, I just have a quick response to that,
yeah.
Is that you could see that as someone who was not as much in touch with the comics buying public as people that he collaborated with, perhaps. But you could also make the case, which I think is borne out by the show and the panel and all of this, that it demonstrates his idiosyncrasy. It demonstrates the way in which he was true to some internal sense of what he wanted to do. And if that wasn't selling, I'm sure he was not happy about that, but I also don't think that that was the ultimate goal, was to figure out ways to boost his sales.
But the other point is that, like Fantastic Four sold so well with Kirby and Lee. And
Right, but I mean,
some people said he doesn't sell well on his own. but
when we
that's
think
it.
about comic books, we think about something where the sales figures sort of become the source of validation, right? All of us play this game, especially in Los Angeles, where we watch the box office receipts of movies that we want to do well, see, whether they do, whether the receipts accord with our taste or judgment, as if those numbers are some kind of referendum on our taste. There's some kind of validation on our taste. I mean, New Gods didn't sell in Fantastic Four numbers, but it still outsold, I bet, almost any comic book published today, 40-odd years later, right? So these things are I think, relative to context, right? And we see how generative. It's funny how DC canceled New Gods and Forever People within less than 2 years, and then within 5 years sought to revive them, and sought to revive them again and again and again, often without much long-term success. Doug?
I just wanted to point out how with the Fourth World, I think the only sort of vaguely conventional superhero was Mr. Miracle, who had like a superhero name and some powers that a typical adolescent might think were cool, but with Jimmy Olsen and the Newsboy Legion, and then the Forever People and the New Gods was like, how many of them were there? It was like, the gods, it was all, they were all very, they weren't invisible to all or whatever, So I think maybe Kirby was deliberately trying to expand the mythological vocabulary of the superhero genre, and it wasn't allowed to play out. It might have caught on if it had been allowed to stretch out a little bit, but it just wasn't, immediately hitting that.
Well, I think also something that the show bears out as well is that Kirby on his own was rougher, more raw, and less pretty. I think when he died, Neil Gaiman made the point that Kirby was a great artist, but he was not a pretty artist. And so this is really unlovely work in some way. It's not the slickness that Joe Sennett gave Kirby with his inks. It's not as smooth, or edges are not smoothed down. But I think that's the way he wanted it. And I think it's why, surprisingly enough, when I go back to read the Marvel books, I find Stan Lee's writing, which I used to really, valorize, almost unreadable. And I find Kirby's writing, which I used to excoriate, really bracing and intriguing to me. So I just think that there was something going on other than the drive for commercial acceptance. That, maybe he wasn't happy about at the time, but is probably the reason we're here.
I think we have time for a couple of other questions or comments, and I've seen a couple of hands. Fred?
I just wanted to talk a little briefly about the comic book business at the time. Was that comic books were being distributed on a newsstand.
This is Rand Hoppy of the Jack Kirby Museum and Research Center, by the way.
They were being distributed on the newsstand, and at the time there was a burgeoning development of fan comic book dealers who would go into the newsstand distributors and take bales or packages of comics out of the warehouse, and those were not reported as being sold. Money was exchanged, but they weren't reported sold to the comic book publisher. And there's one particular scholar, comic book dealer, Bob Bierbaum, who has reported that in his experience, there were any number of Jack Kirby comics that were taken out of the distributors, being Forever People and New Gods, and for some reason Mr. Miracle was not as desired by the comic book dealers. And wouldn't you know that it was Mr. Miracle that had the good numbers that kept on, but New Gods and Forever People, which were the ones that numbers weren't being reported accurately, were the ones that were canceled. So that actually the comics were being reported by the distributors as being destroyed and not sold, whereas they were actually making it to the comic book fan market.
We'll follow up Adam and then this gentleman over here.
Sure, and of course, Paul Levitz has, proclaimed a lot that he looked back at the sales figures, and DC thought they were going to get Superman-like numbers from Kirby, so they ordered, quantities that then made it seem like a failure. But it also has to do with the churn of popular taste. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, you were talking about alternatives to the superhero mythos. I mean, Kirby's most unqualified hit at the time was Commandy, which was very far afield of the typical, superhero mythos. And also, I mean, there's been a telling and very depressing quote from Carmine Infantino when he's justifying canceling the Fourth World, saying, the college kids were really flaking out over it. He means freaking, but whatever. But it just didn't have the sales like among the kids. And of course, nowadays you would think, let us target that niche, let us select that audience. But that wasn't the mentality of the times.
Sir, over here.
Yes, you were talking earlier about Kirby's roughness, but earlier in his career he was known for the romance comics, which, romance is in a bit of a revival right now. I was wondering if you could talk about some of his goodwill art when he was really drawing the romance genre.
Well, we know that, we know this thanks to a scholar named Harry Mendrick, who worked with Joe Simon even in recent years before Joe Simon, Kirby's longtime partner, passed away. We know that between about 1947 and 57, a decade later, that Jack Kirby drew more pages of romance than he did of any other genre, and in fact of all the other genres he worked on combined during that period. And we know too, we've talked about this before, some of us, that romance enabled Kirby and Joe Simon to buy houses in the suburbs, right, in Long Island. Kirby moved his family from Brooklyn to Long Island and had a house next door or right across the street from his partner Joe, and romance did that, because the romance comics that they published with a publisher called Press really did that. We don't tend to think about those comics today, except insofar as they become part of the Marvel Comics blueprint, sort of soap opera, melodrama, and continuing relationship stories. We kind of see that as part of the, if you look closely at the Marvel superhero comics in the 60s, we can see the romance being kind of in the DNA there as part of what makes those a different kind of superhero comic. But the truth is that romance comics, which we try to note in the exhibition briefly, were maybe 1/4 of the entire comic book market by the end of the 40s. Jack Kirby was the first artist known for drawing romance comics. It's still the case that many people look back at Jack's romance comics and think that the characters are unlovely, right? At times change, or maybe we read back into those of Kirby that we know from the later years. I would say go into the exhibition and look at the few examples of romance we have there, and think of those alongside the examples of Barda, the sort of superhero that appears in Mr. Miracle comics. We have several of those where there's a pin-up-like aspect to it, but there's also a depth to the character. That feels like another deferred response kicking in. One of Kirby's unrealized projects in the early 70s was to be a romance revival called, get this, True Divorce Cases. While he was creating the New Gods and Forever People and everything, and another unrealized project from that period was to be an African-American themed romance comic called Soul Love. Right? He was always willing to go back there. He was not unwilling to go back there. The market was unwilling to return there in 1970, 71. But he was always willing to kind of go at it, especially if the topic might be expanded or the people represented in the comic might be expanded. So I don't know that I've addressed your question, except that the romance comics are really, really important. They're sort of what connected Kirby of the 40s to the Kirby of the 60s in ways that we still haven't studied enough. Diana Schutz has she is here or was here, one of our catalog contributors has a wonderful essay about Kirby's romance comics. It's the first essay in the catalog. So we definitely want to call attention to that. We have a number of contributors to the catalog here that are not on the dais with us, which is probably my mistake. That includes Glenn Gold, Mark Badger is here, who contributed 2 essays. Diana may still be here, so buttonhole these people and ask them to sign your books when you go across the street. I think we're out of time, and we should give people a chance to revisit the gallery. So thank you so much for your time.